"What about Ariana?" someone asked. Chaka Khan didn't even blink. "Okay. Her? You like Ari? She's all right. Good on her." Her voice trailed off as she pretended to faint. "I'm fallen. Somebody catch me." Then she straightened, her eyes sharp, her tone turning to steel. "Plus, I don't want to sing with another woman. I ain't got nothing to say. Okay, with a woman. You say it by yourself." It sounded like a joke, a diva moment, a meme for the internet. But underneath that tired humor was something else. A woman who had already survived too much, seen too much, lost too much. At 72 years old, Chaka Khan lives tucked away in a quiet pocket of Los Angeles, miles from the arenas she once set on fire, far from the roaring crowds that used to chant her name until their voices broke. The curtains in her house are almost always closed. Neighbors quietly say they rarely see her step outside at all. And for the first time in her life, the Queen of Funk has gone almost completely silent. How does a woman who once shook the world with her voice end up like this? Alone, sick, exhausted, surrounded by secrets she never wanted exposed. Behind the records and the glitter sits a file most people never open. A son once accused of murder, 4 decades of addiction battles, shattered friendships with other divas, betrayals buried inside the industry, family wounds that cut deeper than any applause could ever heal. Because Chaka Khan's tragedy isn't the story the public thinks it already knows. It's the story she spent a lifetime trying to bury until everything finally collapsed around her. Her downfall didn't start with drugs. It didn't start with fame. It didn't even start with men. It began the moment the world quietly decided that Chaka Khan didn't belong to herself. Everything that would one day nearly destroy her was already forming long before she walked onto a stage, long before she hit that first note that made a room fall silent, long before headlines started calling her a queen. The roots of her tragedy were planted in the streets of South Chicago, in neighborhoods carved up by violence, fear, and survival, places where childhood ended early and trust could get you hurt. She was born in 1,953 inches, a cramped apartment on the south side, where winter winds slipped through cracked windows and sirens sliced through the dark like warning alarms. Poverty wasn't just a situation, it was the atmosphere. Mothers hurried children inside before gangs claimed the sidewalks. Police cruisers looped the blocks like restless sharks. Abandoned buildings sometimes lit up in flames at night, orange against the black sky. Every corner carried a lesson: protect yourself, or you won't last. By 1965, Chaka was only 11 years old when she joined her first street gang. Not because she craved chaos, but because, in South Chicago, being unaligned was its own death wish. She walked to school with her fists clenched and shoulders squared, copying the older girls who had managed to survive long enough to teach her how. She became tough because the environment demanded it, and under that armor there was still just a scared young girl, already learning how to hide terror behind a stare that dared anyone to challenge her. Music became the only door that opened out. Her voice was too fierce for her age, too raw, too honest to be ignored. But talent, especially in a world that preys on the young, can be both a gift and a trap. And for Chaka, it became both at once. In 1969, at just 16, she joined the Afro Arts Theater, a collective built around African culture, revolution, and music. For the first time, she tasted a kind of freedom: drums, poetry, radical thought, and songs that made her feel like she belonged to something bigger than the streets. But it was also the first time she started walking into rooms full of adults who noticed her for reasons that had nothing to do with just her voice. She found herself surrounded by musicians twice her age, activists with complicated personal lives, men with magnetic power and their own secrets. In that world, lines blurred easily. The applause in those small theaters was intoxicating. The attention wrapped around her like stage lights. And the danger, at first invisible, was quietly moving closer with every show, every rehearsal, every late-night conversation. Within a year, she joined Rufus, the band that would change everything and set her on a path she could never fully step off again. Joining Rufus was like stepping straight into a storm. One moment, she was a Chicago teenager, The next, she was traveling from city to city, performing in smoky clubs, cutting demos in cramped studios, and being thrown into the orbit of older men, record executives, aggressive managers, and powerful figures who knew exactly what a rising star was worth. The industry began circling her like wolves. By 1973, Rufus had exploded across the country. Their records took over radio stations, shows sold out. And at the center of all that electricity was Chaka's voice, ferocious, soulful, impossible to ignore. She was only 20 years old, barely old enough to rent a car. But to the people around her, she wasn't a young woman. She was an asset, a product. Insiders would later summarize it coldly. She was a 20-year-old girl with $1 million voice, and everyone wanted a piece of her. Producers wanted control. Managers wanted access. Older men wanted intimacy. Labels wanted ownership. And almost no one in those rooms full of contracts and cocaine seemed to see an actual human being standing in front of them. She was young. She was brilliant. She was surrounded. And under the weight of it all, she was already starting to crack. The collapse didn't begin with a headline. It began quietly. Cocaine crept into her world in 1974, introduced casually at after-parties, studio sessions, and dressing rooms. It was the drug of that decade. Executives used it, musicians used it, assistants used it. It kept the nights going, kept the exhaustion numb, kept the touring machine moving. For Chaka, cocaine made the endless schedules feel survivable. It took the edge off fear, off pressure, off loneliness. But the moment it entered her bloodstream, the industry's hold on her tightened. Then heroin arrived, not presented as temptation, but as an escape. Some people later said it came through a boyfriend. Others believed it was passed from someone within the band. And there were darker whispers, unproven but persistent, that someone wanted Chaka dependent. Because a dependent artist is easier to control, easier to manipulate, easier to drain financially. Whatever the real origin, heroin wrapped around her fast. One of the stories most fans never heard traces back to a backstage corridor in San Francisco, late 1976. During a major show, Chaka reportedly collapsed just behind the curtain. Her body went limp, her breathing turned shallow, her pulse grew erratic. Crew members panicked. A manager rushed to have any drugs hidden immediately. A promoter insisted she be revived at any cost. Refunds were unthinkable. When she finally came back around, still shaking, barely able to stand on her own, they pushed her out onto the stage anyway. The audience roared her name, never knowing she had nearly died minutes before stepping into the spotlight. That collapse wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a pattern. Between 1975 and 1977, Chaka's life fell into a terrifying cycle. Record, tour, crash, revive, repeat. She covered bruises with makeup. She hid shaking hands behind dramatic gestures. She buried panic attacks under oversized sunglasses and stage swagger. On stage, she was a goddess untouchable, blazing, larger than life. Off stage, she was coming apart. And many of the people around her, older, more experienced, more powerful, watched her struggle without truly stepping in. Because a broken artist is often easier to own than a free one, by 1977, whispers began drifting up and down the coasts, from L.A. to New York. Chaka's being controlled. Somebody's got her wrapped around the drugs. She's not even spending her own money. She doesn't know who's really handling her contracts. Whether those claims were fully true or only partially, the impact was the same. People believed she was trapped. And Chaka, young and spiraling, felt it herself. She felt the walls closing in. She felt the eyes watching her every move. She felt the weight of fame pressing down on her chest like a permanent hand. By 1978, the girl from Chicago, the one who learned to dodge gangs, navigate poverty, and survive chaos, was now facing something she couldn't punch, couldn't see clearly, couldn't run from. Fame had rescued her from the streets, and fame had cursed her with a new kind of prison. This was only the first chapter in the tragedy of Chaka Khan. The music had made her immortal, but the cost of that immortality was just beginning to surface. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. The stage made her untouchable. The drugs made her disappear. The tragedy of Chaka Khan did not reach its darkest point when she overdosed, or when she collapsed behind a curtain. It did not peak when she lost control of her voice, her body, or even her bank accounts. It peaked the moment her addiction slipped past the velvet ropes and studio doors, walked into her home, wrapped itself around her children, and began tearing apart the only thing she loved more than music, her family. Because the truth is this: Chaka Khan's most brutal battles were never the ones fought under stage lights. They were fought on kitchen floors, behind locked bedroom doors, inside rehab centers, and in the terrified, uncomprehending eyes of her own children. The descent began in 1979, right when her career looked unstoppable. She was touring constantly, collecting awards, selling out arenas, appearing on magazine covers. To the outside world, Chaka glowed confident, electric, invincible. But behind the polished interviews and explosive performances was a woman drowning in demands. Cocaine had become routine. Alcohol was a steady companion. And heroin, quiet, seductive, deadly, turned into the chain she could not break. There were nights when she walked on stage with her pupils blown wide, her lips trembling from withdrawal, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the microphone with both fists. She covered it with charisma, with jokes, with that legendary roar in her voice. The audience had no idea she was sometimes high enough to nearly forget her own name. By 1981, addiction had woven itself into every corner of her life. Days blurred. She slept until afternoon, then lurched awake as the sun went down, consumed by the need to use. Some nights she didn't sleep at all. The rituals of addiction, hiding, lying, bargaining, promising, breaking promises, became so normal she couldn't see how violently they were reshaping the lives around her. Her daughter, still a small child, learned early how to sidestep rolled-up bills and syringes on the bathroom tile. She learned to read her mother's mood from the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the fast, uneven steps of panic, the slow, dragging rhythm of a crash. Then came 1983, the year the illusion shattered. Chaka was living in Los Angeles, in a house where the curtains stayed shut and the air was thick with stale smoke and unspoken fear. According to reports, child services intervened after a neighbor heard incoherent shouting, followed by days of eerie silence coming from inside the home. The official file reportedly mentioned suspected substance abuse, an unsafe environment, and emotional instability. Chaka temporarily lost custody of her young daughter, an event so traumatic it became a permanent fracture in the family's timeline. Fans were told it was just a misunderstanding. It wasn't. It was the first undeniable sign that the addiction had crossed a line there was no easy way back from. The mid-1980 seconds turned into a blur: tour buses, dim hotel rooms, blackouts, sudden disappearances. Chaka chased highs the way she once chased melodies, obsessively, relentlessly, convinced that one more hit could finally silence the chaos tearing at her mind. She would vanish for days and then reappear as if nothing had happened, brushing off concern with a laugh or a half-hearted excuse. But everything was happening. Her money slipped through her fingers. Her health cracked. Close friendships eroded. And inside the home, her children watched their mother morph into someone they barely recognized, someone they loved but couldn't trust to stay present. The breaking point came in 1988, in the kitchen of her Los Angeles house. Her teenage son, Damian Holland, walked in early one morning and found her on the floor unconscious, white foam at the corners of her mouth, her skin shockingly cold. He screamed for help. A relative tried to revive her. Someone dialed 911 with shaking hands. The paramedics, according to those who were there, knew what they were dealing with the moment they saw her pupils. For Damian, that morning seared itself into his memory like a brand. For Chaka, it was proof of something even darker. She was no longer only destroying herself, she was destroying the people who depended on her. The incident never became a headline. No splashy scandal, no magazine cover, no television interviews. The industry moved quickly and quietly. She was valuable. She was a name, and names like hers were protected, not exposed. The public never heard about the morning Chaka Khan nearly died on the kitchen floor in front of her child. Between 1990 and 1994, the fight became impossible to hide from those inside her orbit. Chaka reportedly entered rehab 7 times in just 4 years. Malibu, Santa Monica, Arizona, New York. Some stays lasted weeks, others lasted only a few days before she disappeared again. One doctor later claimed that Chaka came within inches of death more than once. Her body was pushed past its limits by years of heavy use. Her immune system faltered. Her memory slipped. Her weight swung dangerously up and down. She had moments of piercing clarity followed by collapses so sudden she would wake up not knowing what city she was in. Through these years, the industry kept most of the details out of the spotlight. Stories circulated behind the scenes, whispered in dressing rooms and management offices. A former tour manager privately claimed that in New York in 1992, Chaka passed out seconds before she was due to walk on stage. According to that account, the team dragged her into a nearby hotel room, flushed drugs down the toilet, wiped her face, changed her clothes, and scrambled to invent a cover story. They told the promoter she had a throat infection, but backstage staff were convinced. They knew the truth. Chaka had been too high to stand. Some insiders said that was the night she should have died. And the rumor that followed was cruel. Someone in the camp supposedly cleaned up the scene faster than paramedics could arrive because canceling the show would have cost too much money. Publicly, her career kept going, albums released, award shows attended, guest appearances booked. Privately, her life unraveled like thread pulled from a seam that never should have been touched. Relationships collapsed. Trust dissolved. Family gatherings often decayed into shouting and tears. Even the music that once saved her began to slip away. Some studio sessions ended with Chaka storming out in frustration, unable to sing through the tremors of withdrawal. During this period, she started repeating a phrase that family members would never forget. "My life is cursed." She believed it. Fully. She believed that something trauma, fate, a shadow was following her, stalking her through every era of her life. Therapy didn't silence it. Music no longer drowned it out. Drugs couldn't erase it. And each time she looked at her children, the people she loved most, she saw not their faces, but the damage, the missed moments, the fear, the instability she had allowed into their lives. That guilt became another addiction, another weight, another way to run from herself. By 1996, Chaka Khan stood at a crossroads most people never live long enough to see. Either die young like so many artists before her, or turn and face the demons she had been sprinting from since the 1,970 seconds. She chose to survive. But survival came at a cost. Because what happened to her family during those years, the scenes they witnessed, the secrets they held, the scars they carried left wounds no comeback, no award, no sold-out show could ever fully heal. The tragedy of Chaka Khan isn't just what drugs did to her. It's what they did to everyone who loved her. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. Some tragedies end a tour, some end a career. This one shattered Chaka Khan's soul. It unfolded in a way no mother is ever built to handle, sudden, brutal, merciless. One moment, Chaka was fighting her own addiction, clawing her way back from the edge. The next, she was pulled into a nightmare so violent it ripped open every wound she had ever tried to bury. Because no overdose, no failed rehab, no broken relationship came close to the pain of what happened in September 2004, when her son became the center of a case that would hang over her family for years. It was Los Angeles. Late summer, the air thick, hot, heavy. Sirens in the distance, the kind of day when tragedy feels slower and meaner, like time itself refuses to move on. 17-year-old Christopher Bailey, who was connected to Chaka's family through her son Damian Holland, was found shot inside an apartment linked to them. The official police report was cold and clinical, stripped of emotion. But the scene itself was chaos. A mother screaming. Neighbors crowding their balconies. Officers moving through narrow hallways. Flashes from crime scene cameras bouncing harshly off white walls. Within hours, the news rippled through the industry fast, sharp, unforgiving. Chaka Khan's son was being charged with murder. For the first time in decades, Chaka wasn't the headline, as a singer, as an icon, as a legend. She was a mother begging anyone who would listen to believe that her child was not a killer. She had survived overdoses. She had survived scandals. She had survived betrayals and the wreckage of her own addiction. But nothing had prepared her for the cold reality of staring at her son through the glass of a holding room, knowing his future now depended on evidence, lawyers, and a system she could not control. She did the only thing she knew how to do. She sacrificed everything. She mortgaged her house. She drained bank accounts. She sold jewelry, artwork, personal items she had once promised herself she would never let go of. Friends later said it looked like she was throwing her whole life into the fire just to save what was left of her family, emptying everything the way someone throws water onto a burning home, frantic, desperate, praying it might be enough. She hired top Los Angeles defense attorneys, private investigators, expert witnesses. Every dollar she had earned from decades on the road seemed to evaporate overnight. But money could not erase what the forensic reports suggested. When the first details came back, the case became even more unsettling. The autopsy showed a gunshot trajectory that didn't perfectly match the original story. The weapon reportedly carried no usable fingerprints from Damien, none on the grip, none on the barrel, none on the trigger. Neighbors said they heard arguing, but could not clearly identify the voices. Timelines had gaps. There were seconds no one could account for, actions no one wanted to explain. Police documents, according to later accounts, contained contradictions and unexplained silences. Some officers reportedly believed the shooting might have been accidental. Others suspected panic and terrible decisions made in a split second. The district attorney saw enough confusion and enough suspicion to move forward with charges. For Chaka, the uncertainty was its own form of torture. Every night, she lay awake, replaying the fragments she knew and the ones she feared. Imagining the terror inside that apartment, imagining her son standing over a dying teenager, imagining a moment where a single mistake turned a teenage argument into a death that would haunt them all forever. She blamed herself not for the gun, not for the trigger, but for everything that came before, for the chaos, for the instability, for the years when addiction ruled the house. She knew better than anyone how trauma leaves residue, how it moves through families long before anyone notices the wave crashing. The case dragged into 2005, then into 2006. It stretched on like a wound that refused to heal. Chaka sat through hearing after hearing, her hands shaking, her sunglasses hiding the exhaustion carved deep into her face. Reporters saw a celebrity in a courtroom. She felt like a ghost attending her own slow-motion funeral. Family members would later describe that period as a never-ending burial. Hope rose and then collapsed every time new evidence surfaced or a new ruling came down. Then, after years of fear, headlines, and legal warfare, the verdict finally came. Damien was acquitted, not guilty. The court decided there was not enough solid evidence to convict. Chaka collapsed into tears outside the courthouse. Cameras caught it. Headlines focused on her relief, on the image of a mother embracing her son. But victory was not the end. It was just another twist. Because the legal system had one more blow to deliver. The victim's family filed a civil lawsuit. And civil court does not require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It lives in the world of probability, responsibility, and balance of evidence. In late 2006, a civil jury found Damien liable for wrongful death. The judgment came to more than $1.3 million, money Chaka did not have. Money she would never truly be able to pay in full. Money that turned the acquittal into something hollow, almost meaningless. This was the moment Chaka's body began to crack under the weight. Stress ate at her. Guilt swallowed her. Fear soaked into everything. She started leaning on prescription painkillers not for a high, but to numb the relentless pressure, the headlines, the photographs she could not unsee, the questions she could not stop asking herself. What began as medication for anxiety and insomnia slowly shifted into another addiction layered on top of the old ones. By 2011, her dependence on painkillers had reportedly become so severe that there were days she moved through her own home in a fog, disoriented, like someone standing inside a life she no longer recognized. Doctors warned her again and again. Her heart was at risk, her liver was at risk, her brain was at risk. Rehab centers took her in quietly, sometimes under pseudonyms, protecting her from the press. Nurses later said she cried night after night, not for her career, not for her trophies, not even for her health. She cried for the young girl who died in that apartment. And for the boy who never fully healed from being accused of taking her life, the tragedy didn't end with the verdict. It seeped into the family, twisting everything it touched. Holidays became tense. Conversations turned fragile. Damien reportedly struggled with depression, anger, confusion over who he was allowed to be after all of it. Chaka withdrew even further. She began avoiding cameras, interviews, crowds, even fans. She felt watched, judged, haunted. And the harshest judgment wasn't coming from strangers. It was coming from herself. According to one close friend, years after the case had settled, Chaka confided that the truth of that night was something she would carry until the end. She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't need to. The truth she carried wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about impact. The knowledge that whatever really happened in that apartment, accident, panic, mistake, or something the courts could never fully untangle, would remain tied to her family forever. For Chaka Khan, the murder accusation wasn't just another headline. It was the final blow in a life already carved up by trauma and survival. It was the event that broke her spirit in a way nothing else had. The tragedy she survived physically, but never escaped emotionally. And from this point on, her story only grew darker. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. Not every wound comes from a needle, a bottle, or a courtroom. Some are carved by applause, by backhanded compliments, by people who stand next to you on stage while quietly cutting you out of the frame. There is a kind of pain that doesn't come from poverty or overdose. It comes from proximity, from the people smiling in photographs with you while secretly hoping to replace you. For Chaka Khan, the years between 1997 and 2015 were not defined by hit records. They were defined by betrayal. Silent betrayal, public betrayal, industry betrayal, sisterhood that never truly existed. Feuds that the public heard about only in fragments, if at all. It began in 1997 in a rehearsal studio in Midtown Manhattan. Flickering fluorescent lights, yellowed walls stained by decades of cigarette smoke. A charity event was being organized, nothing massive, nothing designed for headlines. Just a lineup of R&B powerhouses rehearsing a medley. But inside that room, under those tired lights, Chaka Khan and Whitney Houston collided in a way that would linger over both of them. The conflict itself was simple, symbolic. One held note, one spotlight, one spot at the very front of the formation. According to people who claimed to be there, the tension felt almost physical, thick, charged, suffocating. Chaka believed she had earned that center position through survival, legacy, and time served in an unforgiving business. Whitney believed she deserved it through raw global superstardom. They didn't scream. They didn't fight. Instead, there were razor-sharp glances, tight, measured breaths, a quiet standoff between two women who knew exactly what that center spot meant. Eventually, the musical director split the moment between them, slicing the spotlight in half. But the damage was already done. The whispers began that very night. Whitney feels threatened. Chaka feels disrespected. The industry, always hungry for conflict it could control, didn't step in to fix it. It simply let the tension simmer. As the 2000s rolled forward, that unspoken rivalry began to deepen. Because in a world built on charts and egos, there is rarely room for two queens at the top. Fans saw collaborations and smiles. The industry saw competition and fed it. The next crack didn't come from an enemy. It came from someone much closer. Between 2003 and 2009, Chaka's relationship with Mary J. Blige began to shift. At first, they seemed like sisters in survival, public praise, private support, mutual admiration. Two women from different eras, bonded by scars only they could understand: addiction, chaos, heartbreak, comebacks. But as Mary's fame surged into a new stratosphere, something in the air changed. Interviews began to include subtle jabs, nothing obvious, just sharp little phrases that didn't quite match the smiles. Performances started to feature quiet exclusions. A note held a little longer, a mic turned up a little louder, a camera angle that favored one over the other. Industry insiders claimed Mary began borrowing from Chaka, her vocal runs, her styling, even certain stage mannerisms. Fans noticed things too, a look exchanged on an award show stage that felt too cold, a compliment that sounded a bit too hard-edged. The feud never exploded publicly. No massive blow-ups on camera, no explicit call-outs. But the tension was real, and the people in the rooms with them felt it like a draft under a closed door. For Chaka, who had already survived the 70 seconds and 80 seconds with new scars, these betrayals weren't gossip. They were devastating. Because she had walked into the industry alone. She had battled addiction alone. She had held together a broken family almost alone. She thought at least other women who had survived the same storms would stand shoulder to shoulder with her. Instead, some of them cut the deepest. But nothing hit her harder than what happened in 2012. The night Whitney Houston died alone in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton. Something inside Chaka collapsed. It wasn't just grief. It was recognition. She saw her own reflection in Whitney's story. The drugs, the exhaustion, the manipulation, the pressure to perform when the body and mind were already collapsing. Whitney's death felt like a message, a warning. A future Chaka believed could have easily been hers. For months, she avoided cameras, reportedly turned down interviews, skipped red carpets. She didn't want to talk about Whitney. She didn't want to talk about herself. She didn't want to stare into mirrors that now felt like crime scenes. She fell into a heavy depression, convinced more than ever that fame was not salvation. It was a cage built specifically for women like them, gifted, black, powerful, and endlessly exploited. She told people close to her that Whitney's death proved something she had long suspected. The industry would rather watch its icons die than truly help them heal. Then came 2015, the year the industry quietly rebranded her with a new label. Not legendary, not pioneering, not queen, just difficult. The word spread through phone calls and emails she was never copied on, booking conversations she was never invited into. Suddenly, doors that had once swung open for her now stayed half-closed. To the public, it looked like maybe she'd become hard to work with. But the truth, according to many on the inside, was more calculated. Chaka wasn't being erased because she was unstable. She was being erased because of politics, egos, and the unspoken hierarchy that decides which legends still matter and which ones can be quietly pushed aside. Younger R&B acts saw her as competition for tribute spots and limited stage moments. Promoters saw her as a risk, haunted by her past. Some managers thought she was too honest, too blunt, too unwilling to play along with public narratives she knew were false. There was one incident in Atlanta, backstage at a music festival, that insiders still talk about. Chaka arrived, ready to perform, makeup done, outfit on, band prepared. Only then did she find out that her set time had been slashed without warning. She retreated into her dressing room and stayed there for nearly an hour, behind a closed door. Backstage gossip claimed that another female artist, someone with more current chart power, had demanded extra stage time. The easiest solution, according to the whispers, was to cut Chaka. No apology, no explanation, just erasure. And it wasn't an isolated moment. Between 2013 and 2015, she was quietly left off lineups for tribute shows, anniversary specials, and industry celebrations that should have included her by default. When her name didn't appear, the explanation was always the same. She's hard to handle. She's unpredictable. She brings drama. But the simpler, uglier truth was this: she was no longer convenient. While all of this unfolded, her private life was still drifting toward the edge. The trauma of her son's murder case never really left. It folded itself into the corners of every room she entered. The painkillers she had used to survive those legal years still called to her in the quiet hours. She didn't fall fully back into addiction, but there were nights when she stood disturbingly close to the edge. By her late 50 seconds, the combination of long-term drug use, grief, betrayal, and psychological exhaustion had reshaped her into someone even she barely recognized. On camera, she still appeared brilliant, strong voice, sharp wit, radiant presence. Behind closed doors, she was shrinking, turning down invitations, ignoring certain calls. The industry that once crowned her had started treating her like an artifact brought out when useful, shelved when not. Her trust evaporated. Her circle thinned. She declined collaborations she didn't believe were genuine, even if they could have boosted her profile. Slowly, she arrived at a truth the industry never puts on award show scripts. It's not always the drugs that destroy artists. Sometimes, it's the people who claim to care. From 1997 to 2015, Chaka Khan survived feuds, humiliation, quiet blackballing, and attempts to rewrite her place in history. She survived whispers designed to replace her, alliances designed to break her, and comparisons designed to reduce her to a footnote. And when she emerged from that storm, there was almost nothing left of the girl who once stepped into the spotlight, believing that sisterhood and talent would be enough to protect her. Chaka Khan learned the hardest lesson of all. In this business, the blade that cuts the deepest is usually the one you never see coming. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. When the applause finally dies, some legends are left alone with nothing but their ghosts. There is a moment in every fallen icon's life when the noise doesn't fade gently, it cuts off, violently, like someone flipping a switch. For Chaka Khan, that moment didn't arrive when her career slowed. It didn't arrive when the industry turned on her. It didn't even arrive when addiction nearly took her life. It arrived when she understood a brutal truth. If she wanted to stay alive, she needed distance. And distance meant isolation. What followed was not peace. It was exile, the kind that strips a woman of everything except her memories and the ghosts she never learned how to silence. After decades of spinning between arenas, rehab facilities, courtrooms, and desperate attempts to rebuild herself, 2016 became the first year Chaka tried to reclaim what was left of her life. She completed rehab again, this time for prescription painkillers, and walked out of the clinic with trembling hands and a fragile resolve. She knew a lesson many addicts only learn too late. Relapse isn't just a decision, it's a shadow. And shadows wait at the door the moment you let people back in. So she made the most painful decision of her career. She began cutting almost everyone out. Old friends were gently pushed to the edges. Some former collaborators found their calls unanswered. Family members were told to check in before visiting, and even then, most visits were short, uncomfortable, weighed down by history. Chaka wasn't furious. She was afraid. Afraid that one familiar voice, one old pattern, one vulnerable night could drag her back into a darkness she knew she would not survive a second time. Her house turned into a fortress. She lived almost like a monk inside a cage she had built for herself. And in that quiet, where no crowds roared and no band tuned up in the next room, something else began to grow: loneliness. By 2018, she had reportedly withdrawn completely into a small home near Woodland Hills, tucked at the end of a quiet street where, according to neighbors, she rarely appeared outside. The curtains stayed closed. Deliveries were left at the gate, not the door. She avoided malls. She avoided airports. She stayed away from studios unless the work was unavoidable. Her voice still held flashes of the fire that once shook arenas, but her body moved with the weight of someone who had fought too many wars with too little backup. On certain days, people close to her said she would walk slowly through her backyard, fingertips brushing the bark of a tree she had planted years earlier, as if reminding herself that something she touched could still grow in the sunlight, even if she no longer trusted it for herself. The industry tried to reach her. Managers, promoters, collaborators called. Very few of those calls were returned. Then came 2020, the year the entire planet shut down. For most people, isolation was a shock. For Chaka, it was familiar, expected, almost inevitable. She vanished from public view during the pandemic. No live streams, no virtual concerts, no interviews, no social media confessions or carefully crafted statements. Fans began to panic. Online rumors claimed she had died, relapsed, been hospitalized, or slipped quietly into yet another rehab program. None of it was confirmed. None of it was firmly denied. The quieter truth was harsher and sadder. She was alone. The silence around her became so complete that even people close to her admitted, in private, that they sometimes wondered if she was deliberately letting the world forget she existed. Her absence didn't feel like a break. It felt like a disappearance, the slow dimming of a star that once burned too bright, fading into a darkness so deep that only those who looked closely could still make out her outline. By the time 2022 arrived, the emotional cost of years spent in isolation had carved itself into her face, her voice, her body language. She rarely smiled fully anymore. Eye contact became rare, brief, uncomfortable. Conversations shortened into fragments. Those who visited her described seeing the same quiet scene again and again. Chaka sitting on a couch, hands folded, staring at photographs spread out in front of her. Not the magazine covers, not the award show pictures or studio snapshots. The personal ones. The people she had loved. The people she had lost. Family members described her as quiet, in pain, drained by memories she couldn't escape. They said she carried a kind of bitterness toward the industry, not loud, not explosive, but a deep, quiet ache. The kind that forms when someone realizes the same system that crowned her a queen later drained her dry and walked away. And there was one fear she reportedly never voiced in public, but whispered to trusted people more than once. The fear that her children would inherit her demons. She had seen exactly what addiction did to her. She had watched how trauma slips through bloodlines. She had stood and watched her own son drown in a legal nightmare that nearly destroyed him. And she spent her later years terrified that it could happen again, that the curse she believed she carried would echo forward into another generation, long after the cameras stopped caring. That fear sat on her chest like a permanent weight. No rehab program could lift it. No tour could distract from it. No award could balance it out. Between 2023 and 2024, her world reportedly shrank even more. The industry moved on. Younger artists owned the charts. Award shows paid tribute to her name in neatly edited segments, praising her influence while quietly leaving her off stages she once ruled without question. Old friends drifted. Some died. Others simply stopped calling. And Chaka, now in her 70s, watched the world from behind a veil she refused to lift. Those close to her said she almost never talked about the future. She talked about rest, about sleep, about wanting quiet, not the cruel silence of being forgotten, but a softer silence, the kind that feels like finally exhaling after holding your breath for decades. The cruelest part is not that Chaka Khan stepped back from the world. It's that, in many ways, she felt she had no other option. Fame had taken too much. The industry had demanded too much. Addiction had stolen too much. And the betrayals, the deaths, the trials, the broken friendships, the shattered trust left her with almost nothing to stand on except her own fading strength. This became the final twist in her story. Chaka Khan survived almost everything: drugs, scandals, rivalries, accusations. But she could not outrun the loneliness that waited on the other side of survival. At 72, the Queen of Funk still existed alive, breathing, moving through the quiet rooms of a house filled with trophies and silence. But the woman inside that house was no longer the young Chicago girl with a blaze in her chest, no longer the superstar who held arenas in the palm of her hand, no longer the icon who reshaped soul music. She was a woman who had been consumed by the very life she once dreamed of. Her legacy remained. But the health, the family unity, the friendships, the everyday happiness she fought for did not. Those things slipped through her fingers one by one until she stood effectively alone. A queen without a kingdom, loved loudly by millions, held quietly by no one. When you lay Chaka Khan's life out like a case file, the fame, the addictions, the betrayals, the death, the silence, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Some legends don't fall because they are weak. They fall because the world never lets them rest. And now, at 72, Chaka stands as a final warning about what the industry takes and what it almost never gives back. But what do you think truly broke her? Was it the drugs, the betrayals, the loneliness? Or was it the cost of being a black woman, carrying a voice too powerful for a world determined to control her? If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the